Welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and as always, it's great to have you with us. So we're here in the middle of a hot summer here in Oklahoma, and I pray it's nice and cool where you are. Last week, for those of you who watched the video, remember that my wife Cheryl and I were on an Alaska cruise. We were with Amir Sarfati and his ministry, Behold Israel, with Amir Sarfati and Barry Stagner and Mike Golay. And they're on this cruise ship with Holland Cruise Lines, cruising there in Alaska. And so I'm back in my office here in Edmond, Oklahoma this week, and been a massive temperature change coming back here to Oklahoma. But it's great to be back home. It's great to be here, and great to be back with you again from my office here in Edmond, Oklahoma. What I want to talk today about is this blockbuster movie that's come out, Oppenheimer. It's a movie about the first atomic bomb that was developed and detonated near Los Alamos, New Mexico. And so I want to talk about that and just kind of how that's kind of restoked fears a little bit of nuclear war. And many people are saying, this is an important movie because it's reminding people just how destructive nuclear weapons are. And hopefully it'll have a kind of a deterrent and a curb on any idea of using nuclear weapons. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about that movie and some of the history of that, but then really answer an important question. Does the Bible predict a nuclear holocaust in the end times? Does the Bible say anything about the use of nuclear weapons in the end time? So I want to address that kind of in the light of this movie that's kind of just brought the idea of nuclear weapons and nuclear war to the forefront in our culture and society today. Now, when we go to the subscriber only section, I've got three questions I want to answer. One is about Hebrews 9:27, where it says it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that comes the judgment. The question is, well, what about those who go in the rapture? They won't die. So we need to understand that in light of the rapture. Then a couple of pretty controversial theological questions. One is, can women be pastors, teachers, and leaders? That question is kind of being asked in light of the Southern Baptist Convention disfellowshipping Saddleback Church. And then another question, obviously, that's been very controversial down through the ages, can you lose your salvation? So we're going to get into those issues during the Q&A time in just a bit. But again, I want to talk about this movie, this blockbuster movie that's come out titled Oppenheimer. That's really kind of refocused the world on the dangers and the destructions of nuclear weapons. Now, the movie is set back in the 1940s with what's called the Manhattan Project. The whole project really for nuclear weapons began in New York City, but they took it from there to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, and other places. But the Manhattan Project was led by a man named Robert Oppenheimer. Of course, that's where the movie gets its name from him. But he was a famous, well-known quantum physicist. And he led the Manhattan Project, where America was really in a race against time to get a nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany did. And in God's providence, America was able to do that, which basically ended the war. But Oppenheimer took a group of scientists down to Los Alamos, New Mexico, in a highly secretive place. There's all kinds of protections that were taken down there in that area. And the reason they went there is eventually they wanted to detonate the first weapon near there, which is out in the middle of nowhere. But 4 atomic bombs were created there in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The first one was detonated about 200 miles south of Los Alamos. And it was July 16th, 1945. It's interesting, the code name for that project was Trinity. Many people wonder, well, why did he pick the name Trinity? Does it have something to do with God? And realize that they're kind of unleashing the power of God. Well, it's believed that Robert Oppenheimer took this from John Donne's Holy Sonnet number 14. Begins with the words, batter my heart, three-personed God. This idea of the Trinity. But it is kind of ironic, I think, in many ways that the beginning of the unleashing of nuclear weapons in our world was called Trinity. Again, a reference to God, who, of course, has all power and all might, and who has allowed man to unleash the power of the atom. So that was where the first one was detonated. The second one, of course, was detonated in Japan, in Hiroshima, the third one at Nagasaki, and the casing of the fourth bomb still exists today. But when Oppenheimer, when that first that atom bomb was detonated, he actually quoted the Hindu book, the Bhagavad Gita, that says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Realized what power had been unleashed in the world. It's interesting to me that in the late 1940s, you have the beginning of the atomic age. You have the beginning of the UFO age. Started up in Washington State and was also down in New Mexico as well. That's kind of interesting, the connection there with the atomic age. But also in 1948, you had the birth of the modern state of Israel. So the convergence of a lot of dramatic events there in the late 1940s. So it's the beginning of this atomic age. Now, many people wonder then, will nuclear weapons play a role in the end times? The United Nations just this last week had this headline: risk of nuclear weapons use higher than any time since the Cold War. Vladimir Putin has issued repeated nuclear threats and has actually transferred some nuclear weapons from Russia over to the neighboring country of Belarus. North Korea has about 30 to 40 nuclear weapons. Just this last week, they fired off 2 ballistic missiles. Of course, those ballistic missiles are the missiles that carry that nuclear payload. And he said just this week that the presence of a U.S. submarine in South Korea could spark World War III. He's very upset about that. There are right now in the world about 12,500 nuclear warheads. Russia has about 6,000 of them. The United States has a little bit over 5,000. China has a little bit over 400. You go on down the line, and North Korea has about 30. But there are 9 nuclear nations today, but Iran is right at the nuclear threshold. And so with all of this, people wonder, how long can the kind of the genie be kept in the bottle, if you will? When is Pandora's nuclear box going to be opened? Does the Bible predict a nuclear war in the end times? Well, there are several passages in the Bible that people believe predict a nuclear war. Isaiah 24:19 and 20 says, the earth is broken up, the earth is split asunder, the earth is violently shaken, the earth reels like a drunkard, it sways like a hut in the wind. So heavy upon it is the guilt of its rebellion that it falls, never to rise again. Well, that passage is in the context of the tribulation period, I believe, and the seal and the trumpet and the bowl judgments that God is bringing on the earth. Another passage is Zechariah 14. You remember the very beginning of Zechariah 14 is the second coming of Jesus. He comes and sets his feet on the Mount of Olives, and it splits in half. And down in verse 12 of Zechariah 14 says, this is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. On that day, people will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. I've heard a lot of Bible teachers over the years say that this predicts, a nuclear holocaust. People's flesh rotting and their eyes rotting in their socket and their flesh kind of melting off of them. But again, notice in this passage, it says, the Lord will strike the nations. They'll be stricken by the Lord with great panic. So this is something that God himself is doing. This isn't the result of some kind of a thermonuclear exchange. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 to 13, it says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. So again, people look at this and say, this looks like a nuclear explosion going off. And it does mention here the idea about the atoms being untied, like nuclear fission, where atoms are divided. It's like a nuclear explosion. But I think this is referring to God destroying the heavens and the earth right before he makes the new heaven and new earth. This is what I call uncreation. God spoke everything to existence in Genesis 1, and in Revelation 20 and 21, he's going to speak everything out of existence. Just a little earlier in 2 Peter chapter 3, it says God destroyed the world the first time by the flood. He's going to do it the second time by fire. It was God who did it the first time. It's God who'll do it again. So this is referring to God's destruction of the world, not a destruction by nuclear weapons. One final passage. Many people point to Revelation chapter 8 and the trumpet judgments. There's 7 of these trumpet judgments. Let me read a few of these in Revelation 8, beginning in verse 10. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down to the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that became bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark, a third of a day was without light, and also a third of the night. So if you read that, it does sound a lot like some kind of nuclear explosions going off on the earth. But again, I think this is referring to divine judgments from God. The seal judgments earlier in Revelation 6 are from God. The Lamb opens those seals. These seem to be judgments from God. And then the bowl judgments at the end, the angels that bring the bowl judgments come from God's temple in heaven. So this is divine in origin. You'll notice this is all limited in scope as well. It's not some kind of a global nuclear exchange. Also, many of these judgments in the trumpets and the bowls in the book of Revelation are very similar to the Egyptian plagues, water turning to blood and so on. Remember, the Egyptian plagues were sent by God. They weren't the result of man's activity. So I think that gives us another hint that this is divine in origin. And also, several places in the book of Revelation, the people on earth blame God. They blaspheme God and blame God for the judgment. So they know that it's not just coming from humans, that it's coming from God himself. So I don't think the world will be destroyed by a Middle Eastern madman or by some Russian renegade. God is the one ultimately that will uncreate this world and create a new world. Now, having said that, it's difficult for me to believe, though, that nuclear weapons won't be used at some point in the future. I mean, there's 12,500 of them in the world today. And with all the conflict and tension in our world, it's difficult for me to believe that they won't be used at some point in time. What we can say, I think, is they're not predicted, I don't believe, anywhere in the Bible, but the Bible also never says anywhere that they won't be used. So certainly nuclear weapons could be used before the rapture takes place. They could be used after that, and God simply doesn't record it in Scripture specifically. So it's hard for me to believe that they won't be used at some point in time, but how and when they're used, I don't know. I would just say I don't think they're ever predicted specifically in the Bible that they're going to be used. One final thought here. One of Robert Oppenheimer's closest friends was a man named Dr. Arthur Compton. And he's actually the one that put Oppenheimer in charge of the Manhattan Project. And here's something I wrote a while back. Let me read this to you. It says, Dr. Arthur Compton was one of the committee of 6 scientists appointed by President Roosevelt to create the first atomic bomb. Later in a magazine article, he recalled the day in 1942 when he and the other scientists conducted their first experiment in a squash court in Chicago. He described the different reactions, relief, concern, excitement, when the experiment was successful, and they realized that a power had been unleashed that would change the course of history. Compton knew that life on earth would never be the same, and he concluded and said this, "Man must now go the way of Jesus or perish." What a statement. As a nuclear physicist, man must go the way of Jesus or perish. And that's really the choice for the world today. And it's really your choice and my choice. Tragically, the world is perishing. But you and I don't have to perish. We can go the way of Jesus by trusting in him and putting our faith and our hope in him. And I pray that you've done that. If we've done that, we have nothing whatsoever to fear for the future. Well, let's go into the subscriber-only section now. I want to answer those questions about Hebrews 9:27. It's appointed a man once to die, how that relates to the rapture. The question about women pastors and the question about losing your salvation. So we'll go into that subscriber-only section. If you're a subscriber, thank you so much for being a part of endtimes.com. And if you're not a subscriber, you can go to endtimes.com for just $7 a month. And you can become a subscriber and have access to all kinds of wonderful information. So let's go into our question and answer time now.